Take a look at that shiny iPhone you're holding in your hand. The sleek design, the flawless craftsmanship, that premium feel in every detail. Apple products have become more than technology. They've become symbols of a lifestyle. But what if I told you that the company behind this device once started as a rebel, defying the system, challenging the rules, only to evolve into one of the most powerful, most control-oriented companies on Earth? In 1984, Apple introduced itself with a Super Bowl ad inspired by Orwell's dystopia. A lone figure throws a hammer at a giant screen, shattering the voice of total control. The message was clear. Apple would free you from corporate monopolies like IBM, and for a long time people believed that story. But today, nearly 40 years later, Apple stands in a very different position. Whether you notice it or not, Apple now shapes what you can install, what you can access, and even how you can fix the device you paid for. So how did we get here? How did the rebel become the gatekeeper? To answer that, we need to go back to the origin myth. A garage, two Steves, and a promise that felt like a revolution. In the late 1970s, when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak began building computers in a garage, their goal wasn't just to create a product, it was to shift power. At the time, computers were massive, expensive machines reserved for governments and large corporations. Apple wanted to bring computing to ordinary people, and the idea of a computer in every home sounded radical. The Apple I and Apple II moved that promise closer to reality, making technology feel approachable rather than intimidating. Then in 1984, the Macintosh arrived and changed the experience entirely. A graphical interface, icons, a mouse. Suddenly, a computer didn't feel like a cold corporate tool. It felt like something creative, personal, even fun. Against the rigid, utilitarian image of IBM and the emerging dominance of Microsoft, Apple positioned itself as the brand of individuality. This was more than marketing. It became a worldview. And at the center of that worldview was Steve Jobs' obsession with design, not just how a device works, but how it feels, how it looks, and what it says about you. That obsession would become Apple's superpower, and later one of its strongest tools of influence. Steve Jobs didn't treat design as decoration, he treated it as ideology. He wanted technology to feel like art, and he demanded beauty even in places most users would never see. If someone argued, "No one will notice," Jobs' response was famously blunt, "I will." That mindset shaped Apple's identity, a company that promised not only function, but taste. And once a company sells taste, it sells status. And once it sells status, it begins to shape culture. Apple's products started to feel like more than tools. They felt like statements. Owning a Mac wasn't just owning a computer. It was joining a tribe of creative people. That emotional connection made Apple's story powerful, because it wasn't built on specs. It was built on meaning. And the most effective meaning is the kind that makes customers feel like protagonists. This is exactly what Apple refined in the 1990s, turning its brand into a message aimed at people who wanted to stand out. That message had a name, and it would become one of the most iconic campaigns in modern marketing. Think different. Think different wasn't just a slogan, it was a narrative weapon. Apple filled its ads with historical icons: Einstein, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Picasso, Lenin, and subtly suggested a connection. If you admire people who changed the world, you're the kind of person who chooses Apple. That's not selling a computer, that's selling identity. And it worked. Apple stopped being a brand and started feeling like a life philosophy. Product launches turned into cultural events, and customers lined up not only to buy a device, but to participate in a ritual. This kind of loyalty is rare because it isn't based on logical comparison. It's based on belonging. But here's the twist. Once a company becomes part of your identity, it gains a different kind of power. Criticism feels personal. Switching feels emotional. And when that loyalty matures, the company can begin shifting its strategy without losing its audience, because the audience isn't the only buying products anymore. They're buying a world. That's why Apple's real transformation begins when Jobs returns in 1997 and the company decides to build not just devices, but an ecosystem. In 1997, Apple was struggling, and Steve Jobs returned with ruthless focus. He simplified the product lineup, sharpened the brand, and made a decision that would define the modern Apple, the closed ecosystem strategy. The idea was simple. Apple products would work best inside Apple's own world. iTunes would feel perfect with the iPod. The iPod would feel more natural with the Mac. Every piece would make the next purchase feel less like a choice and more like a logical continuation. This wasn't just good design, it was strategic gravity. The ecosystem created comfort, and comfort created dependence. Because once your music, your photos, your workflow, and your habits live inside one system, leaving doesn't just mean buying a different phone. Leaving means rebuilding your routine. And most people don't want to rebuild their routine. They want life to be smooth. This is how a closed ecosystem becomes attractive. It doesn't look like a cage. It looks like a home. And then, in 2007, Apple introduced the device that would lock this strategy into millions of pockets, the iPhone. The iPhone launch in 2007 is legendary because it wasn't just a new phone, it was a new center of gravity. Jobs framed it as 3 devices in one: a widescreen iPod, a revolutionary phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator. Then he delivered the twist. These were not 3 separate devices. This was one device, and it would be called iPhone. The crowd erupted because it felt like witnessing history. And it was. Smartphones existed before, but Apple made the idea mainstream by turning complexity into simplicity. Yet here's the key. Apple delivered this revolution alongside a structure of control. The more central the iPhone became to daily life, the more valuable it became to control what happens on it. Because if the phone is your camera, your bank, your entertainment, your communication, your identity, then the gatekeeper of that phone holds extraordinary leverage. Apple didn't need to announce control loudly. It could integrate control quietly into quality, security, and consistency. And the mechanism that turned this quiet control into a business empire had a name that sounded harmless: the App Store. When the App Store launched in 2008, it looked like a golden age. Developers could reach millions of users. Anyone could build an app and distribute it globally. Downloads exploded. The story felt like freedom, until you noticed the fine print. Every app had to pass Apple's approval process, and Apple would take a commission on sales. Over time, that commission became a massive revenue engine, and more importantly, the App Store became a border checkpoint for digital life. Apple wasn't only selling hardware anymore, it was managing the rules of the ecosystem. The company could decide which apps were acceptable, which business models were allowed, and which services could thrive. That is what it means to be a gatekeeper. And the most powerful part is this: most users accepted it because it felt like safety. Fewer scams, fewer broken experiences, more trust. But trust has a cost. Once you accept a gatekeeper, you accept that someone else defines allowed. And when the platform becomes the default place where everyone must exist, that gatekeeper doesn't just enforce quality, it shapes competition. That's why the App Store debate isn't about one company's policy. It's about who controls access to modern life. Here's what makes Apple's control so difficult to resist. It often arrives disguised as comfort. Your devices sync effortlessly. Your photos follow you. Your earbuds switch automatically. Your watch becomes part of your routine. Your passwords are saved, your payments are smooth, your backups are automatic. It feels like the system is helping you, and in many ways, it is. But comfort also creates dependence. The more your life is organized by one ecosystem, the more switching feels like tearing down your own home. Your subscriptions, app purchases, iMessage history, family sharing plans, cloud storage, habits. These aren't just files. They're pieces of your routine. And routines are sticky. That stickiness is power. It means that when Apple sets a rule, the majority of users don't fight it. They adapt to it, because adapting is easier than rebuilding everything. This is why the ecosystem works so well commercially, but it also explains why platform decisions become controversial. Because when a company becomes infrastructure, its choices stop feeling like product choices and start feeling like the laws of reality. And the next chapter is where the gatekeeper role becomes impossible to ignore, because developers and competitors feel the rules first. Imagine you're a developer. You spend months building a great app, then you submit it to the App Store and get rejected. The reason? It doesn't meet Apple's standards. Sometimes those standards are clear, but sometimes they feel vague, inconsistent, or unpredictable. And that uncertainty matters, because when you don't know what the rules really are, you begin designing your product around the gatekeeper's mood. That's not just moderation, it's power. Apple argues it must protect users and maintain quality. Critics argue the system can be used to limit competition and control business models. You can see this tension in areas like cloud gaming, subscription pricing, payment systems, and platform services that compete directly with Apple's own offerings. And because iOS users are highly valuable, developers can't simply ignore Apple's platform. They must either accept Apple's rules or lose access to a huge audience. That creates a lopsided relationship. Apple becomes both the referee and a player in the same game. And once that happens, conflict becomes inevitable. The most visible conflict of all arrived in 2020, and it involved one of the biggest games on Earth, Fortnite. In 2020, Epic Games challenged Apple's commission model by adding its own payment option inside Fortnite. Apple responded by removing Fortnite from the App Store. Overnight, iOS players lost access, and the fight became global. Epic's CEO, Tim Sweeney, accused Apple of abusing its gatekeeper power and used Apple's own myth against it. Epic released a parody of the 1984 commercial where Apple became the giant on the screen. The message was direct. The rebel had become the empire. The legal battle turned into a complicated mix of technical rules and philosophical questions. Some decisions favored one side, others favored the other, but the core debate remained. How much power should a platform owner have over the businesses that depend on it? And where should the line be drawn between legitimate security policies and anti-competitive behavior? This isn't a niche debate. It affects the economics of apps, subscriptions, and digital services that billions of people rely on. And the argument doesn't stop with games. Apple's gatekeeper role also shows up in how it responds to legal and regulatory pressure in different countries, where the rules aren't just commercial, but political. Apple operates globally, and global operation comes with local pressure. In some regions, certain categories of apps have faced restrictions due to legal requirements, regulatory demands, or political sensitivity. Apple's public explanation is typically consistent. It complies with the laws of the countries it operates in. Legally, that sounds straightforward. But critics argue that compliance can become a convenient shield when transparency is limited, because users don't only care that a company follows the law. They care about what values it defends when the law pushes in uncomfortable directions. This is especially sensitive for a company that once branded itself as the champion of freedom. When Apple removes or limits access to certain tools or services in response to local rules, the contradiction becomes visible. And it raises an uncomfortable question: is Apple a neutral platform provider, or an active participant in shaping information access? The deeper the ecosystem becomes, the higher the stakes become. And that brings us to an even more personal form of control. One that isn't about apps or politics. It's about your own device. Because when something breaks, you discover whether you truly own what you bought. Legally, if you buy an iPhone, it's yours. But ownership in practice can feel more complicated. If your screen breaks and you take it to an independent repair shop, your warranty situation can be affected, and in some cases certain features may behave differently after repairs. Apple argues this is for security and quality. It prefers repairs through authorized channels using original parts. That argument sounds reasonable on the surface, but critics respond with 2 points. First, repairs can be expensive, sometimes surprisingly expensive for simple issues. Second, many devices are designed in ways that make repairs harder. Glued parts, specialized screws, tightly integrated components. Difficulty becomes policy. If repairs are difficult and costly, replacing the device becomes the easier option. and the easier option is where business incentives quietly live. This tension exploded into mainstream awareness with a major controversy in 2017, when users noticed that some older iPhones felt slower. Apple explained it as performance management meant to prevent unexpected shutdowns and stabilize battery behavior. But users saw something else, an ecosystem that nudges upgrades when convenience is prioritized over transparency. The backlash to Apple's performance management controversy was intense because it hit a nerve. People felt manipulated. Apple apologized, offered discounted battery replacements, and paid compensation. But the bigger impact was cultural. It gave momentum to the right to repair movement, the idea that consumers should be free to repair devices they own without losing functionality or being punished by design. Supporters argue repair rights reduce waste, lower costs, and weaken monopoly power over service. Apple's counterargument remains consistent. Security and reliability. Unauthorized parts and repairs could compromise safety, and sensitive features like biometric authentication may not function correctly with non-original components. Critics don't deny security matters. They argue security can be real while pricing and design still discourage independent repair. And they point out that when a company controls repairs, it controls not only money, but the lifespan of devices. That lifespan matters because we live in a world drowning in electronics. Millions of devices become waste not because they are truly dead, but because repair feels too expensive or too complicated. That turns a repair debate into an environmental debate, and Apple as a giant can't avoid the question. E-waste isn't a side issue, it's the shadow of modern convenience. When repairing a minor fault feels economically irrational, people replace devices, and replacement culture becomes normal. Apple has announced sustainability targets and environmental initiatives, but critics argue that repairability is one of the most direct ways to extend a device's life. Apple introduced a self-service repair program for certain models, allowing customers to order official parts and use official tools. But for many users, the process remains complex and costly, and the Apple Store still feels like the simplest option. That means Apple still controls the repair pathway for a huge portion of customers. And once a company controls repairs, it controls something deeper than service revenue. It controls how long devices stay in circulation. Now, if hardware control is one side of the story, the other side is digital trust. In recent years, Apple has pushed one message louder than almost any other: privacy. And it's a powerful message because privacy isn't a feature, it's a promise about who you can trust. Apple's privacy narrative is one of the strongest brand positions in modern tech. You've heard the slogans, "What happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone." Tim Cook frames privacy as a fundamental human right and contrasts Apple against companies that monetize personal data more aggressively. And to be fair, Apple has made meaningful moves that users can feel. Features like app tracking. Transparency forced apps to ask permission before tracking, and many users refused. Encryption improvements made some communications more secure. These aren't small steps. They changed the industry. But privacy in the platform era is rarely a simple story, because a company can improve privacy from third parties while still strengthening its own ecosystem power. It can reduce external tracking while increasing internal influence over defaults, services, and flows, and that's where the privacy paradox begins. The same company that protects you from some kinds of surveillance may still benefit from systems that quietly shape your attention, your subscriptions, and your habits. The question isn't, is Apple lying? The question is, what incentives exist behind the promise? The most underrated power in technology is the default. Most people never change default settings. They accept what's placed in front of them because life is busy and convenience wins. That means defaults shape behavior silently, thousands of times a year. In the modern smartphone business, the biggest battles aren't only about hardware, they're about flows: search, ads, app discovery, subscriptions, payments, cloud storage, and attention. Apple has increasingly leaned into services, building recurring revenue streams that don't depend on you buying a new phone every year. That shift matters because it increases ecosystem gravity. Your playlists, backups, storage plans, family sharing, and paid services become part of your routine. and routines are harder to switch than devices. Critics point to large commercial relationships tied to default placements as evidence that privacy and profit can coexist in complicated ways. Then there's iCloud. When you back up data to the cloud, the structure of protection depends on which security options users enable. Strong protections may require users to manually activate advanced settings. That's not unique to Apple, but it reveals a truth. Privacy is often a menu, not a guarantee. And this is where debates intensify, especially when a company proposes safety systems that touch the boundary between protection and overreach. At one point, Apple proposed an on-device system intended to detect certain categories of harmful illegal content. This stated goal was widely seen as important, but privacy and security experts raised concerns about the method and the long-term risk of expanding such systems. The backlash was strong enough that Apple postponed the plan. The deeper issue wasn't just one proposal. It was the principle. Who decides the balance between privacy and safety? And what happens when tools built for one purpose are later demanded for another? Even assuming good intentions, the existence of capability changes the conversation. This is the modern dilemma. A company can genuinely improve user privacy in some areas while still building structural power in others. It can protect you from certain external threats while becoming more central to your life. So the real question becomes broader than Apple. It becomes about the future we're rebuilding when our daily routines depend on a small number of platforms whose incentives are shaped by profit, convenience, and control. And if you want to understand that future, you have to look beyond the screen, because the story continues in the supply chain. Everything looks perfect inside an Apple store: clean lines, bright lighting, soft quiet music, and smooth friendly service. It feels like the future. But behind that storefront sits a supply chain powered by vast manufacturing networks and non-stop production cycles. Over the years, reports and investigations have described long shifts, strict output targets, and challenging living conditions for some workers in major manufacturing hubs. Apple responded with audits, supplier responsibility programs, and annual reporting designed to track progress. Supporters say these steps matter. Critics say the core system is still shaped by cost pressure and relentless efficiency. And it is hard to ignore the margins. A device's build cost can be a small share of the retail price, with the rest funding R&D, marketing, logistics, and profit. Apple is not alone. Almost every major tech company relies on similar structures. But because Apple is so large and profitable, expectations rise. And supply chain concerns do not stop at factories. They reach raw materials, where global sourcing can involve regions flagged for uneven labor protections and weak safety standards. Modern smartphones depend on global minerals and complex sourcing networks. Some of the materials used in batteries and electronics come from regions where labor protections and safety standards have faced criticism from international organizations. Apple has made commitments around responsible sourcing and independent audits, and it has published reports describing efforts to improve traceability and standards. But real change across global supply chains can be slow, and that slowness creates tension. When a company is this powerful, people expect faster transformation and clearer transparency. The uncomfortable truth is that the sleek device in your hand represents not just engineering, but global economics. Every premium feeling has an invisible cost somewhere in the system, which brings us to another invisible system, one that sits far above the factory floor: taxes. Because Apple isn't just a product company. It's a global financial machine, and the way it manages profit across borders has been one of the most debated topics in modern corporate history. Apple is one of the most valuable companies in the world, with enormous reserves and global reach. Over time, it built complex international structures designed to reduce tax burdens legally through licensing and intellectual property arrangements. The basic logic is simple: shift profits into low-tax jurisdictions through internal payments for patents, trademarks, and other rights. Regulators challenge some of these arrangements, leading to lengthy legal battles and public controversy. Apple maintains that it complies with the law and meets its obligations, but ethical debates continue, especially when everyday workers pay straightforward taxes while giant corporations use complex strategies to reduce effective rates. Apple also spends heavily on lobbying, pushing influence into policies and regulations. Again, this is legal, but it fuels a broader concern. When corporations become powerful enough to shape laws, democracy starts to feel uneven. In response, international efforts like the global minimum corporate tax aim to reduce extreme imbalances. This is where Apple's story intersects with a bigger question. Is the modern tech giant just a company, or a kind of quasi-government with its own rules, borders, and incentives? Innovation sits at the heart of Apple's identity, but the debate today is sharper than ever. Is Apple still revolutionary, or mostly refining? Recent iPhone generations bring better cameras, faster processors, and incremental improvements, but the leap that defined earlier eras is harder to see. In the Jobs era, Apple introduced products that reshaped categories, turning smartphones into a mainstream obsession, redefining tablets and pushing wearables into everyday life. Today, Apple's strategy often looks like optimization: improve what exists, protect margins, and strengthen the ecosystem. Vision-style products can be impressive, but mass adoption depends on price, content, and cultural momentum. Meanwhile, Apple has leaned deeper into services: music, TV, cloud, gaming, fitness, recurring revenue that is stable and predictable. That shift is commercially brilliant, but it also changes what innovation means. When the core business becomes subscriptions and platform flows, innovation isn't only about new devices, it's about keeping users inside the system. And that leads directly into one of Apple's strongest forces: community loyalty. Apple doesn't just have customers, it has a community. New launches feel like cultural events. People line up, post videos, debate colors, and treat devices as identity signals. Apple's marketing doesn't merely explain features, it sells a lifestyle: clean, modern, premium, effortless. Even small details inside the ecosystem can shape social dynamics. Messaging habits, platform culture, shared accessories. These things create a sense of belonging, and that belonging can become a shield. When Apple faces criticism, loyal users often defend it, sometimes instinctively. That defense can be understandable. People like what works, but it also reduces pressure for change. If a brand becomes part of your identity, criticism feels personal, and alternatives feel like betrayal. This is how ecosystems become resilient, not only through technology, but through psychology. And the question is whether this loyalty stays healthy. Because loving a product is normal, but treating a corporation like a team can weaken our ability to think critically as consumers. That's why the final chapter matters: the future. Because Apple is now facing forces it can't fully control: regulations, geopolitics, market maturity, and shifting generations. Apple's future will be shaped by pressure from multiple directions. Regulators in the EU and the US are increasingly targeting platform power, pushing for more openness in app distribution, payments, and competition. Right-to-repair laws are also spreading, forcing companies to support consumers and independent repair shops more seriously. Meanwhile, geopolitical tensions make Apple's relationship with China both critical and risky. China is a major market and a major production base, and shifts in politics or competition can quickly become business shocks. Domestic Chinese brands continue to strengthen, and consumer preferences evolve. At the same time, the smartphone market is mature. People keep phones longer. Growth slows. That means Apple must search for new engines: AI, health, new computing categories, new services. But outcomes are uncertain, and innovation cycles are harder now because expectations are enormous. This is where Apple's financial strength helps. It can adapt, invest, and wait. But adaptation requires trust, and trust requires transparency. Which brings us to the mirror ending of this story. Apple isn't a cartoon villain or a perfect hero. It's a reflection of the world we built. Apple's story is a mirror of modern technology itself. A brand that once represented freedom and individuality now runs one of the most controlled ecosystems on the planet. There are no clean heroes or villains here, only complex realities. On one side, capitalism's logic. Successful companies tend to consolidate power. On the other side, Our choices, for convenience, design, and status, we give up certain kinds of control. If you have an iPhone, you don't need to feel guilty. Apple makes genuinely impressive products. Design, experience, ecosystem integration. But being conscious matters. Beneath the shiny surface are trade-offs. And maybe the real question is this: should we expect perfection from a corporation? Companies are profit-driven by nature. The responsibility ultimately falls on us, consumers, regulators, and citizens, to decide how much power we give them and how we hold them accountable. In 1984, Apple showed a figure rebelling against a giant screen. Today, who is the person throwing the hammer? Maybe the answer is on the other side of the mirror. Thanks for watching. Now tell me your view. Which matters more? Full control with less seamlessness, or a flawless system with less control? Android's openness, or Apple's closed but integrated ecosystem? And why? Also, what surprised you most about Apple? Write it in the comments starting with, "The thing that surprised me most was." If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, and share it with friends. Let the debates begin. Which company should I analyze next? Google, Tesla, Amazon, or Meta? See you in the next one. Until then, keep thinking different, but don't forget who told you to.